afternoon and welcome to our second Waterfront Forum. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We had about 275 people register, so I know there are more people coming in, but I think we should get started. I wanted to, thanks to this pandemic, this will feel less like a vast lecture hall and more like you are having a cup of coffee across the table from your own personal archaeologist. My name is Daniel Johnson. I am the CEO for the Edmonds Waterfront Center, home of the Edmonds Senior Center. I'd like to open this program with an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish tribes. Much like our diverse Edmonds community, the Coast Salish represent a large collection of many tribes with distinct cultures and languages that have been stewards of the land and sea for 14,000 years. It is with great honor that we pay our respect to elders past and present. I'm happy to report that we have received our certificate of occupancy for the new Waterfront Center. I only wish we could invite you all in to see it firsthand, but we're closely monitoring the COVID guidelines from the Health District and state, and we will keep you posted. Our vision for the Waterfront Center has been to create a place where the community can gather, learn, and celebrate. But as we are proving again today, we can do that virtually as we wait for the Waterfront Center to open. We are delighted to be welcoming you to our second presentation of Edmonds from the Beginning, a three-part Zoom series with presentations from local experts. Today's topic is Indigenous Peoples, presented by speaker, archaeologist, and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Suquamish tribe, Dennis Luark. I had a chance to talk with Dennis in advance, and you are in for a treat. Dennis has served as a professional archaeologist for 49 years. He received his BA and master's from the University of Washington in anthropology and has conducted archaeological investigations throughout the United States and Mexico. He taught archaeology and cultural resources management at the University of Nebraska, University of South Carolina, and the University of Washington. Dennis was hired by the Suquamish tribe in 2006 as part of the environmental program team in the fisheries department. Dennis created the Suquamish Archaeology and Historic Preservation Program in 2008 and serves as the program manager. He oversees a team that includes a professional archaeologist and a tribal traditional heritage specialist. So the way this program will work is Dennis will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. And so please, if you have questions, please type those into either the Q&A box or for the chat box. So with that, I want to turn this over to Dennis Luark.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd like to do an introduction in Lushootseed, the Southern Coast Salish language. I'd like to raise my hands to my teachers at Suquamish, Randy Purser and Lena Maloney. And the language program's motto is, every time you use Lushootseed, you're breathing life into the language. Hachlahil twel degui. Good day. It's good to see you. Hachsekwi u trust al-slahi. It is nice that we can gather together. Dennis Luark, Tidsta. My name is Dennis Luark. Tualchad Zizialich. I was born in Seattle. Estalchad Alti Slachaltib. I live in the Haller Lake area of North Seattle. Ayuyusbad Alti Desequab. I work at Suquamish. Desequab is the name for the beach at Old Man House, which means the place of the clear salt water. So today we'll talk about Edmonds. And Edmonds is really two places, what I consider the marine shoreline where the original settlement of Edmonds is, but also Edmonds has annexed Lake Ballinger. So we have really two different adaptations and different groups of people. So we have more intensive use of the marine-oriented part of Edmonds along the waterfront by people such as Suquamish and Lower Snohomish River bands, who were more marine-oriented and traveled up and down the coast and came from villages on the marine shoreline. So we had also people coming up to Lake Ballinger, since it has an ethnographic name, from villages and camps on the north end of Lake Washington. And these are generally called the Lakes people, but they consist of a number of different groups. So we have the Suquamish people, the Setobish, the Snohomish people, the Swadebish, the Swinomish people, the Hakwabish, the Lakes people, the Stukwabish, the Snoqualmie people, the Duduwabish, the Duwamish people, and the Sababish people. What contributed to the way people used the landscape? So it depended on their economic focus, whether they were marine or lacustrine or lake people. The kind of technology, there were different canoe types used in rivers and streams compared to canoes that were used in the open waters of Puget Sound. And also whether they accessed marine resources or lake or river resources. Distance to winter villages determined our notion of what territoriality is. If you were near a winter village, that was like the heartland of the local people. And there were winter villages for the Suquamish at Point No Point. There were people from the lower Snohomish group and the south end of Whidbey Island, and also at Hebold, with their main village at the mouth of the Snohomish River. And then the types of resources. One thing that drew Suquamish people in the warm weather months was berries, cattails, and clams and fishing. So the kinds of resources determined where people would go and the time of year, the seasonality. Also, your access to resources depended on your kinship ties. All the tribes were intermarried, and so that would allow you to go into another group's, what you might call territory, but to use those resources because of your ties to other families. What we can document is that there was a lot of contact between people after the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Nisqually in 1833 down at the mouth of the Nisqually River. And then people would travel up and down the Sound to access American settlements and lumber mills. These were all kind of places that attracted Native people during the contact period. So we have oral histories and documentation and the ethnographic record that the marsh complex and the shoreline at Edmonds attracted a number of people. It was a unique environment, and it was on the east shore of the Admiralty Inlet, and people would come from the mouth of the Snohomish River, from Point No Point, from Suquamish to access those resources. In the Lake Ballinger area, we have villages at the north end of Lake Washington that were used by what's called collectively the Lake people. And there is a place named for Lake Ballinger and also the mouth of McAleer Creek. So we know that people came up the creek and used those resources. And those people were related or part of the Duwamish, Snoqualmie, and Sammamish people. So starting at the beginning, as Daniel said, people have been here for at least 14,000 years. And this slide shows on the left side what Puget Sound looks like today, but 15,000 years ago, there was an ice sheet, and it was right about the latitude of Kingston and Edmonds. And so the ice sheet melted and flooded the area south of the ice sheet, and then people came up and settled this area after at least 15,000 years ago. The environment has changed dramatically over the years. Around 11,000 years ago, the sea level was over 200 feet below its current elevation. And so everything in green here, especially on the Kitsap County side, was land. And today, these are all marine embayments. And you can see how close people who were living on this landscape were to Edmonds. Edmonds was not affected as much, but you can see the south end of Whidbey Island. Port Gamble was not a port. Dyes Inlet, Port Orchard, all these areas were actually one part of what we call the Kitsap Peninsula. And what is Bainbridge Island today was not an island. Also at that time, the mouth of the Snohomish River was several miles upstream where Snohomish is. And the mouth of the Duwamish River that we call the Duwamish was actually down by Auburn. So things were really different. As sea level rose and adaptations changed, then people moved and develop an adaptation. And so this is what the Edmonds area, where the Edmonds Marsh is today, Point Edmonds, and the town of Edmonds was in 1872. And this is what drew people moving along the marine landscape. You had a tidal marsh, you had a spit covered with beach grass. And so people would come in the warm weather months, collect cattails, collect berries, harvest clams, fish, and do other activities. And they would pull up their canoes on this sand spit and actually pull them over and have canoes along this area. And archaeologically, we have evidence of this from other landforms along Puget Sound, at Mukilteo, at West Point in Seattle, at Kama Beach, at Port Gamble. And so these resources were unique resources. They were well used by people. And also you can kind of see in this old map from 1872, there actually may be symbols for mat lodges. These are kind of little open squares. Usually a cabin, something like this, would be a black square. So this may actually be a record of Indian people using this landscape. And we know from oral tradition and from ethnographic studies that people were using this area for a variety of activities. And so the Point Edmond name in Lushoot seed was Stubus, which means like a man or a face of a man. And so here's a later map from the US Coast Survey, and it shows how close you are. President's Point was a Suquamish area that came over, Apple Tree Cove, but the northern part, this shows the nascent town of Edmonds in 1903. So Sabah, for a little stream that comes in north of what is the waterfront of Edmonds today. Stubus, like a man, a face of a man, was a name. And then Stubus, like a man coming. And the fact that these have ethnographic names mean people use them. And so if you're traveling along this area, these are like road signs or mnemonic signs that people remembered through oral history. And so there were places they were probably stopping as they traveled along what is actually Admiralty Inlet. And then when you look inland, we have the lake people at the north end of Lake Washington. There was a village at the mouth of what we call Sammamish Slough, Juárez, the growing place. There was a lake named for Lake Ballinger, which back in 1897 was called Macaleer Lake, and it's Sasus face. And then the mouth, there was a campsite, and there may have been a village at the mouth of Macaleer Lake called Seed, the mouth of the face. And there was also another place name for the mouth of Lion Creek. So this line actually, it's not necessarily a line denoting territory, but it shows the drainage area that was utilized by people coming up from the interior in Lake Washington. So the fact that, again, there are place names document people using this area. And it was a vibrant area. People used the shoreline, they used the interior resources. So what would that look like? Cattail mats. This is a Lake River canoe. This is a shelter for warm weather. And these pictures are all from Edward Curtis's work in the early 1900s, the 1890s. But what we use today for like tarps or canvas, people back then would weave these wonderful pieces of cattail into cattail mats. And they would use them not only in their winter village, but they would use them like we use tarps to cover tents. And so this is an example of that wonderful weaving. And where would they get them? Well, the cattail marsh at Edmonds was one of the places that people came to. They not only clammed there and then they fished there and they gathered plants and hunted, but one of the resources was cattails in order to make these wonderful mats. And so this is more of a canoe that you would see on a river or Lake Washington. And this prow shows a maritime canoe. And Suquamish were unique because they didn't have a large river, not like Snohomish or Puyallup or Duwamish. And so they traversed the whole area throughout Puget Sound, Admiralty Inlet. And they used canoes much like we see in this Edward Curtis picture. And then what would they do? Here again, look at the work that they did to make these mats. And they would weave, they would dry food, they would collect food. So this would be a warm weather camp where people would come out of their winter villages that were cedar houses, and they would come and access resources and do multiple activities. And this is a wonderful picture of a maritime canoe with different baskets used for different things. And these open weaved baskets were clam baskets. So when you're digging clams, you would put them in there, you would soak them in the water and get the sand out of them. So it's a unique kind of technology. So what kinds of things would they do? Berry picking was a big thing. And then, again, this is actually a Quinault picture, I believe, from Edward Curtis with this woman has a cedar bark skirt and a hat, and then collecting tules or cattails. Again, these were where they got the material to make those wonderful mats. But they also collected skunk cabbage. They collected roots from different areas, Wapato roots, Indian potatoes they were called. So multiple resources from these wonderful tidal marshes. Collecting mussels. And again, we can see they're using, picking things off of rocks to collect mussels, and they're using digging sticks in order to dig clams. And again, you can see the open weave here of the clam basket, this unique basket that was designed when you collected clams. And here's a good maritime canoe. So what would they do with that? In the wintertime, they would live in longhouses. And so the seasons from March until September, October, people would be out gathering food and drying and storing that food for the winter months when resources were much leaner. And so this is a camp. It shows them drying clams. They would collect clams, and depending on the size, like horse clams, butter clams, they would steam them, and then they would also put them on sticks, cedar sticks, put them over a slow smoking fire, take them off the sticks, and then put them on cedar rope or cordage, and then hang them and smoke them some more. And then they would take these in their canoes back to the winter house. They would hang them in the rafters where they had below, they had fires in the houses. And so this was their winter store of food. They do the same thing with fish. So here's a great picture. You can see it's kind of a modern with an ancestral thing. We have a mat, we have canvas, we have fish smoking, and there's the friendly family dog. And then this is another picture, smoking and drying fish and preparing it for the winter months. So what can we conclude? The Edmonds area was used by many groups. We have the marine shoreline that was used by people that were probably more marine oriented. And the notion of territory is something that comes from Western society. People recognize that areas around, say, the heartland of people, where they had their winter villages, they needed permission to go into those areas. But in areas that didn't have winter villages was a joint use area. And so the closest winter villages that we have along the marine shoreline were at the mouth of the Snohomish River, at southern portion of Whidbey Island, and at Point No Point, and over on the other side of Admiralty Inlet in the Suquamish area. So the best information that we can get from informants and from the studies that were done is that the Suquamish and Snohomish people use the Edmonds waterfront more often and more intensively than other people. The Lakes people, the people on Lake Washington, Lake Sammamish, Lake Union, were all interconnected through kinship and a similar kind of adaptation. So we had people that were probably Duwamish, Sammamish, Snoqualmie, using the Lake Ballinger Hall Creek Basin that they accessed via McAleer Creek. And so when I look at the Hudson's Bay record, we have people moving from the northern part of Puget Sound, Admiralty Inlet, south to the Nisqually River. And so that's why I included the Swinomish. There are three really big traders, people that were part of the trading system after 1833 that are named more often in the Hudson's Bay record and also in the early 1840s by the Catholic Church. And there was like the three big traders and the three big Whigs. And one was Sneetlam, who was Skagit, and Sneetlam Point on Penn Cove is named after him. The other big trader was Witchilacotchli, and he was Snohomish. He was also called the Frenchman because he actually dressed in English and French style. And probably his main village was at Hebulb at the mouth of the Snohomish River. And he's also a signatory to the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855. And the third big trader was Suquamish, Chalicum. Chalicum had a village at Point No Point. He's also named at Old Man House in Suquamish, in downtown Suquamish. And he and Sneetlam actually carried food, information, logbooks between Fort Nisqually at the mouth of the Nisqually River all the way up to Fort Langley, which is now Vancouver, British Columbia, on the Fraser River. And this is all documented in the Hudson's Bay records. So when I say we probably had Swinomish, we had a lot of people traveling north and south after contact, and they likely stopped, or they may have stopped in the Edmonds vicinity. So that would be more of a traveling related use of the area. So we know that people use the warm weather area, seasonal camps to get various resources along the marine shoreline and also in the inland areas. And based on geology and archaeology, we know that the resources such as the cattail marsh that we see at Edmonds probably developed in the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. Archaeological excavations at Mukilteo, at West Point, at Port Gamble, and at Campbell Beach on Whidbey, Camano Island show that these landforms started developing around 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. And as soon as they started developing, then people started using that. So, Hayaf Chud, that means I am done now. Hoi, goodbye, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Dennis, what a fantastic job. This is just fascinating, the information. I could talk with you all day. But we do have some questions here. One observation I had was that there weren't many pictures of men. It seemed like women were doing all the work.
Well, part of that, again, those pictures are Edward Curtis's, but usually there's a lot of men did a lot of the different things too. So part of the record that we're dealing with was Edward Curtis's photographs. But yes, indeed, women did a lot of the work. The men did a lot of the hunting and the fishing. And there's some interesting, observations by some of the Western people, like the women are doing all the work and the guys are over on the beach gambling. So there was some sexual difference in terms of, or gender differences in terms of activities. But again, some of the pictures, the neat things that we see are part of a function of what we have in terms of pictures. So
yes.
But Women's lib, they were running things back then. So it was, it may have been kind of a patriarchy, but the women actually ran things probably.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from one of the participants, and that was the joint use of territory by area peoples found elsewhere in the US, or was that unique to the Pacific Northwest?
No, it was, there are a lot of areas. I was just on the virtual meeting of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. And in the Southwest, there are areas that were jointly used by the Apache, by the Navajo, by the Hopi. So it depended on the resource. And there are other things too, like people, the Puyallup people, Nisqually people are in the area around Mount Tahoma, Mount Rainier. But Suquamish people could see Mount Rainier, and they could also see Mount Baker. And so that figures in some of the oral histories as well. So it really depended on the kind of resource. But, and again, there may have been more travel up and down the Sound and Admiralty Inlet after the trading began after contact. But we do have good records of that. And so like if you're at Swinomish, if you're Sneetlam, and Sneetlam appears over 40 times in the Hudson's Bay record at Nisqually. To go from Penn Cove down to Nisqually, you're going to have to pass by Heabold, which is the main Snohomish village. You're going to have to pass by some of the Suquamish camps. You're going to have to pass by Elliott Bay, where Duwamish and Suquamish had villages. You're going to have to pass by Commencement Bay. So there may have been more travel up and down. At least we have documented travel. And that may have been a continuation of the activity before contact. And we know that access to different areas, again, partially was conditioned by kinship, that if you had kin relations, you could go to areas that may have been outside of your main winter village, but you were married into families there.
Great. We've got a lot of questions rolling in here. Kathleen asked, can you talk about the Sabat area of Edmonds?
It's a place name. It's the mouth of a creek. And so there may have been fish there. We just have the place name, but everywhere today, we may not have salmon runs in a lot of these small streams, but I know on the Kitsap Peninsula side, just about every small creek, based on our fisheries researchers, had small runs of salmon. And so anywhere there's fresh water, a flat place to camp, that might have been one of the reasons why that had a place name. So place names, again, they're kind of like road signs. They're acknowledgement that we use that place, or that you should know about it when you're traveling by canoe. And we would look at a lot of the place names. Most of the place names that Thomas T.T. Waterman got in 1918 to 1920, and John Peabody Harrington got along the coast, they're all along the coast. And so what they're documenting is the fact that people were familiar with that. And it acknowledges that, when you're traveling by canoe, when we look at maps, we're looking at an overhead map, but when you're traveling 2 feet above the water in a canoe, you have a different perspective on what the landscape looks like. So anywhere there was fresh water pretty much coming down into Puget Sound, people probably stopped and utilized those resources.
Wonderful. Jim asked or commented first that Edward Curtis's photos show smaller salmon being smoked. Were the pre-contact Salish more likely to harvest larger king salmon?
They harvest everything. So, there's different ways. Suquamish would troll. They had fish weirs, and they also had nets. And the Duwamish there are 3 main villages. The real Duwamish villages were on the Black River. And so the runs that went into Lake Washington, the Sockeye and the King, were easily accessed at a fish weir. So They would move seasonally. They use different techniques, trawling, nets, um, shoreline netting, different ways. So basically, people moved throughout the season that the salmon were running, and depending on where the main runs were, like the Snohomish, Skagit, the Duwamish, Puyallup, they would congregate there. There were probably multiple groups, multiple tribal groups, using different techniques depending on whether in saltwater or in river water.
Great. You're doing exactly what you'd hope to do. That's capture people's imagination, because there's a series of questions about learning more, where they can learn more. And I want to do a shout out to Janet Smoke, who is the director of the Suquamish Tribal Museum. We visited over there, and it was very interesting. And we're looking for opportunities to maybe do some partnering with them. But if you could comment on where people can learn more about oral histories. Another individual talked about how we can educate ourselves on foraging and food processing skills used by local tribes. So if you could just comment, Dennis, on some of the other resources for those of us who are hungry to learn more.
Well, each tribe, the Duwamish tribe has their longhouse down on West Marginal Way. Hebulb, the Hebulb Cultural Center for the Tulalip tribes. And when I say Snohomish and Snoqualmie, realize that Tulalip is really an amalgamation of Snohomish bands, Skykomish bands, and Snoqualmie bands. So they have a wonderful cultural center up in Tulalip land, up north of Everett. And then the University of Washington, if you go on their digital records, they have some really good essays on Native American people and adaptations. Suquamish website, most of the tribal websites, if you go on Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Squaxin, Puyallup, they always have a short discussion about who we are, who are the Puyallup people, who are the Snohomish people. So if you do searches on that, you will get a lot of information. The Suquamish has a great portion of their website on their history, who we are, the history of the Suquamish before contact, effects of boarding school. So those are great places to start. And again, the UW Library, University of Washington libraries have digital information and essays by people like David Berge and other people that talk about the adaptations. And then Native Seattle by Carl Thrush. David Berge has a book about Chief Seattle. So there are a number of popular books that you can get on Amazon that talk about the lifeways of the people at contact and after contact.
We have time for a couple more questions. Here's one from Pat. Is there any record of inland tribes such as Nez Perce trading this far west?
Most, along the Cascade Crest, the upper reaches of the rivers like the Skagit, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, there's a lot of intermarriage between Eastern Washington people and Western Washington people. I don't know about Nez Perce. I mean, they're pretty far east, but we know that Colville people, all the people in part of the Colville Confederated Tribes, Yakima people, a lot of like Kitsap, Chief Kitsap of Suquamish. Kitsap is really a Yakima name. And a lot of his genealogy in the past, it comes from Yakima. So he had kin relations in the Green River area. So Nez Perce is probably a little far east, but people did intermarry and people did take slaves. And so there were people kind of going back and forth. But most of the interaction that you see is kind of topographic. Where you had the Cascade Crest and people in the upper reaches of like the Skagit River or the Puyallup River, Duwamish River, Green River were intermarrying because people would go back and forth.
So I think we have time for one more question here. So Brenda asks, my family has a cabin on Whidbey near Chief Snakelam's grave. Did
Yes.
the local tribes bury their people individually or in group cemetery-like settings? Have those sacred sites been preserved and respected?
Yes and no. I know where that cemetery is. And prior to contact, a lot of the burials were canoe burials in trees, especially for higher status people. Now, archaeologists have found burials in archaeological sites, but the notion of cemetery burials, Chief Sneetlam was one of the top three, like I said, that were involved in converting Indians to the Catholic faith. And so when Father Blanchette came up to Whidbey Island at the invitation of Chalacum, the Suquamish, who had a village in Eby's Landing, we had Sneetlam coming over and we had Snohomish coming over. So the notion of a cemetery, there were areas that were generally used for burials. They were near villages, but it wasn't the concept of burying people in rows like we think of in cemeteries was not the case prior to people converting to Catholicism.
Wonderful answer. There was a comment that came in from Judith, thank you, who said, don't forget your local libraries. The librarians can help you find information and even get books to you free. So I think that's a good reminder. I think with that, we are going to bring this to a close. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I just want to do a pitch for our third in the series, our next Waterfront Forum on Wednesday, February 10th. We'll also start at noon. The topic is Early Settlers, Sawmill Town with Katie Kelly from Edmonds Historical Museum. So Dennis, thank you again. What a spectacular presentation.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to seeing everyone on Wednesday, February 10th. Thank you.
Thank you.